A smirk, a touch, and a lesson that goes beyond yoga. Will their connection stretch beyond the studio? The yoga studio was a serene oasis, nestled on a quiet street away from the hustle of the city. Its walls were adorned with calming hues of pale green and soft beige, and the scent of lavender wafted through the air, immediately putting anyone who entered at ease. Natural light poured in from the large windows, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow that made everything feel soft, almost dreamlike. He stepped in hesitantly, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished bamboo floors. His name was Alex, 25, still unsure about this decision. A friend had recommended yoga to help him cope with the stress of work, but this was his first class. The thought of moving through stretches and postures in front of others made him self-conscious, especially when his body was so stiff from years of neglect. His clothes were tight around the shoulders, a stark contrast to the graceful, fluid movements he imagined yoga to demand. He felt out of place. As he made his way to the back of the room, setting up his mat in the far corner, his eyes scanned the other students. They were calm, confident, stretching with ease, each movement like poetry. He could barely touch his toes without feeling a pull in his lower back. His nerves tightened, but there was something about this quiet, peaceful space that made him feel like he could try, even if he wasn't ready. Then she walked in, Sophie, the teacher. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a simple black tank top and form-fitting leggings, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and the way she moved was effortless, like she was part of the room itself. When she turned to face the class, her eyes briefly met his, and for a moment, he felt something unspoken. She smiled, but it wasn't a welcoming smile, it was knowing, almost playful. "All right, everyone, let's begin," Sophie's voice rang out, warm yet firm. Her gaze settled on Alex, who had begun his warm-up with a hesitant stretch. Her smile widened into a smirk. "Your form is all wrong," she called out, the sound of her voice carrying through the room. Alex's face flushed with embarrassment as everyone turned their attention to him. The smirk on Sophie's face lingered just a moment longer than he expected, and for a split second, he wondered if she was enjoying his discomfort. But there was something else in her eyes, a quiet challenge, an invitation to do better. It was at that moment he knew, he wasn't just here to stretch his body. There was something else Sophie had in store for him, something that went beyond mere yoga. The following week, Alex returned to the yoga studio, his nerves simmering just below the surface. His previous encounter with Sophie lingered in his thoughts, her playful smirk and the way she'd called him out for his form. He'd never expected yoga to be so intense, so demanding, and yet, there was something about it, something about her, that kept drawing him back. Today, Sophie was leading a more challenging class, and Alex knew this would push him even further out of his comfort zone. As the session began, Sophie guided everyone into a series of stretches, her voice steady and soothing, as though the calmness she projected was a way to guide them through the discomfort. Alex tried to follow her instructions, but his body was stiff, his movements still too rigid and unsure. He could feel his muscles resisting each pose, his breath shallow as he tried to maintain balance. Sophie moved around the room with fluid grace, offering corrections and gentle encouragement to the other students. She didn't seem to notice him at first, but then, during a particularly difficult stretch, she stopped in front of his mat. Her eyes assessed his position, the slight slouch in his shoulders, the way his legs were twisted in the wrong direction. "Alex," Sophie's voice was calm, but there was a knowing quality to it, like she understood exactly where his body was struggling. "You're not quite aligned. Let me help." Her words, though soft, carried a weight. The air between them shifted instantly, a quiet tension that Alex couldn't quite put into words. Sophie moved closer, her hands hovering near his body. He had been prepared for this, she had corrected him last time, after all, but the proximity now felt different. It was no longer just a teacher-student interaction, there was an underlying current, a subtle connection that seemed to crackle in the air. Sophie didn't wait for him to speak, her hands gently placing themselves on his lower back, guiding him into the correct position. Her touch was light at first, barely there, but the moment her fingers made contact, Alex felt a surge of awareness ripple through him. His spine straightened under her guidance, the pressure in his lower back easing as he followed her movements. "Relax your shoulders," she murmured, her breath warm against his ear. The proximity made Alex acutely aware of her presence, the softness of her voice, the warmth of her touch, the scent of lavender and sandalwood that seemed to linger in the space between them. His pulse quickened, but there was no room for awkwardness now. He tried to focus on the posture, on the release of tension in his body, but the sensation of her hands on him, a steady, guiding pressure, was overwhelming. He felt her fingers press into his back, her palms spreading across the muscles in his shoulders, working to loosen the tightness that had settled there. There was something about the way she touched him, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, that sent a quiet thrill through him. It wasn't sexual, it was purely physical, but the sensation left a trail of warmth on his skin, a gentle burn that had nothing to do with the physical stretch and everything to do with the emotional charge in the room. Sophie's hands shifted slightly, adjusting his posture again. This time, her fingers brushed lightly against his arm, a fleeting contact, but enough to make his skin hum. She didn't meet his eyes immediately, instead, she focused on his form, but Alex couldn't help but notice the subtle glance she gave him, the slight raise of her brow, the curve of her lips as she offered a soft smile. It wasn't an overly flirtatious smile, but it was enough to send a jolt through him, an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. "Better," she said, stepping back. "You've got it now." Her words felt like a small victory, but it was the way she looked at him after, her gaze holding his for just a moment longer than necessary, that made the victory feel like something more. He had no idea what it was between them, but he knew this wasn't just about yoga anymore. Sophie had changed the dynamic in a way that was impossible to ignore. As he moved into the next pose, Alex felt a flutter of something new, a sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure where this connection was heading, but he felt his desire to impress Sophie growing, along with a curious pull toward her. And it wasn't just because of the way her touch made him feel, it was something deeper, something that only yoga, and perhaps her, could unlock. The weeks following that first intimate moment on the mat were a blur of stretching, bending, and twisting. But with every class, Alex found himself more and more drawn to the calming presence Sophie exuded. She was a master of her craft, guiding her students with such ease and grace that it was almost as if she wasn't just teaching yoga, she was creating a safe space where emotions could quietly unfurl, where connections could bloom beneath the surface. Alex came to realize that his initial discomfort had faded, replaced by something deeper. His body began to change, loosening up, moving with more fluidity. He felt the weight of stress he'd been carrying in his shoulders for years gradually lift, as if each class was chiseling away at his old, rigid self. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that kept him coming back, it was the subtle shift in his feelings toward Sophie. She was unlike anyone he had met before. Confident, calm, and self-assured in a way that was neither overbearing nor distant. Sophie had a quiet vulnerability about her that Alex couldn't quite put into words. It was in the way she carried herself, in the pauses she took during her teaching, the moments where she allowed her students to breathe not only physically but emotionally as well. The dynamic between them had shifted subtly, no longer was it just about correcting his form. The moments between them had become more personal. She would occasionally offer little words of encouragement when he seemed to falter, her voice calm and reassuring, always steady. He started to look forward to those small exchanges, where she saw his struggles, his effort, and didn't just point out his flaws. She acknowledged his growth, his efforts. One day, after an especially challenging session, the class had just finished a final deep stretch, and Alex lingered on his mat, trying to stretch out the last bits of tension in his body. Sophie, as always, moved to the front of the room, speaking softly to the class as they began to roll up their mats and prepare to leave. But this time, she didn't immediately leave. She walked over to where Alex was still sitting, still breathing deeply, and sat down beside him on the floor, her legs folded beneath her in a relaxed posture. He hadn't expected this. Sophie never hung around after class, always moving on to her next commitment. But today, there was something different in the way she was looking at him, soft, yet serious, her dark eyes gazing at him with an intensity that caught him off guard. "Alex," she began, her voice low and steady, "I can see how much you've improved these past few weeks. Not just in your physical practice, but in the way you carry yourself." Her words were more than just a compliment, they were a recognition of something deeper, something Alex hadn't fully realized himself. He had come to yoga to relax, to find some mental and physical peace, but in the process, he had begun to uncover parts of himself he'd neglected for a long time. And Sophie had seen that. "Thanks," Alex replied, unsure of how to express the gratitude that swelled in his chest. He wanted to say more, but the words didn't come easily. He wasn't used to being this open, this vulnerable. Sophie smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that seemed to say she understood. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, there was silence between them, a quiet space where neither of them felt the need to speak. It was in this stillness that Alex realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't just admiring Sophie for her yoga expertise or her calm demeanor. There was an emotional connection between them, one that was starting to build, layer by layer, each class, each conversation, each shared moment. "Yoga has a way of drawing things out of you," Sophie continued, her voice still soft but tinged with an unspoken depth. "It's not just about the poses, it's about understanding yourself in a way you've never seen before." Alex met her gaze, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked, and he felt something stir deep within him. It was more than attraction. It was a sense of emotional recognition, something unspoken, but undeniably real. He wasn't sure if Sophie felt the same way, but there was a warmth in her smile that made him feel seen, in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. They sat there for a while longer, in the peaceful aftermath of class, neither of them rushing to speak or leave. The connection that had quietly developed over the last few weeks had now blossomed into something undeniable, a bond formed not just in the physical movements of yoga, but in the shared understanding of each other's struggles, both visible and hidden. As they finally stood to leave, Sophie placed a hand gently on his arm, a casual, yet intimate gesture. "Keep coming," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you're doing great." And in that moment, Alex realized that yoga wasn't just about his body, it was about opening himself up to something far more transformative. Something that, whether he wanted to admit it or not, had started with Sophie. As the weeks passed, Alex found himself increasingly captivated by the quiet intensity of his yoga classes. At first, it had been about physical improvement, but slowly and subtly, something deeper had begun to shift within him. Yoga was no longer just a way to unwind after a stressful day, it had become a journey, one that, he now realized, was intertwined with Sophie's presence. She was always there, guiding him, pushing him, but more importantly, she was starting to feel like someone he could confide in. It wasn't just the way she corrected his form anymore. It was the way she made him feel understood, as if every session brought him closer to not just improving his body, but getting in touch with a side of himself he had long ignored. Every time Sophie moved around the room during class, her presence was magnetic. She didn't just guide her students with commands, she made them feel seen, as though each movement was a conversation between teacher and student. But Alex started noticing something more. She was always close, just close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body when she adjusted his posture, the scent of lavender and sandalwood trailing after her as she moved. It wasn't an intentional closeness, yet it stirred something in him. It was as if every glance, every brush of her hand against his arm, was building a quiet tension he couldn't quite shake. One day, after a particularly intense session, Alex decided to stay behind, not wanting to rush out of the studio and into the chaos of his workday. He wasn't ready to leave the calm that had settled within him, a peace that only seemed to grow when he was in the studio, surrounded by the soft hum of music and the lingering scent of incense. Sophie had noticed that he often lingered after class, and today, instead of heading to the back room to grab her things, she walked over to where Alex was finishing up his stretches. Her presence was immediate, filling the quiet space around them. "You always stay after class," she said with a smile that wasn't playful this time, but sincere, with a hint of curiosity. You don't have to, you know. It's okay to take a break and just be. Alex glanced up, meeting her gaze, feeling his heart race just a little. I guess I just like the calm, he replied, his voice lower than usual, as if the vulnerability of the moment was beginning to settle in. He had been lying to himself, convincing himself that yoga was just about improving his body. But there was something else. Something in the way she looked at him, something in the way her eyes softened when she spoke. She nodded thoughtfully, her expression turning introspective for a moment. Yoga's about balance, between effort and surrender. It's not just for the body, but for the mind as well. Her words hit him with unexpected clarity. It wasn't the first time she had said something like that, but today, in this moment, it felt like she was speaking directly to him. Her words seemed to resonate deeply, stirring something inside him that he had long forgotten, his need for balance, not just in his physical body, but in his life. They both stood there for a moment, the silence between them stretching longer than either of them had anticipated. Sophie was so composed, so at ease in this stillness, yet there was an intensity in her eyes that made Alex feel like she could see right through him. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, as if trying to understand the layers he had built around himself. I think you're starting to see that, too, she said softly, her voice low but filled with meaning. Yoga isn't just about bending and stretching, it's about opening yourself up to more than you expect. Alex felt the pull of her words, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge something he'd been denying. It wasn't just yoga that was changing him, it was her. There was something about Sophie that drew him in, something both gentle and powerful that made him want to get closer, to understand her the way she seemed to understand him. There was a tension in the air, one that had been building over the past few weeks. Sophie didn't just help him with yoga poses, she was helping him reconnect with himself in a way he hadn't thought possible. And that connection, as subtle as it was, felt like it was slowly transforming into something more, something undeniable. Her eyes flickered to his hands, which were still resting on his mat, the fingers lightly gripping the edges. She smiled faintly, a smile that was almost unreadable but filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through him. You're doing great, she said, her voice soft but sincere. He nodded, unsure of how to respond, feeling a rush of emotions he wasn't quite ready to articulate. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could ignore the way his heart fluttered when she was near. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, a connection that was starting to feel like it was no longer just about the yoga or the physicality of their interactions. As the class came to an end and the studio began to empty out, Alex realized he had no intention of walking away from this newfound connection. Sophie had opened something within him, something that wasn't just physical but emotional. And as the door to the studio closed behind him, he couldn't help but wonder just how deep this connection could go. The following weeks in the yoga studio felt different, charged with an energy that neither Alex nor Sophie could quite define. It wasn't just about the poses anymore. It wasn't just about yoga. There was a palpable shift in the air between them, a tension that lingered even after the class ended. It had been building slowly, layer by layer, until one fateful day it reached a point where both of them could no longer ignore it. It happened during a particularly demanding class, one of those sessions where the room was thick with concentration and the air hummed with effort. Sophie had decided to challenge the class that day with a new series of poses, ones that required not only strength but balance and focus. Alex had been struggling with one of the more difficult poses, a deep stretch that required him to bend backward, his arms over his head, his chest open. His muscles were tight, his breath uneven as he tried to hold the position. He could feel the strain in his body, but there was something more in the air today, something that made his pulse race and his heart beat a little faster. Sophie moved around the room, offering corrections, her voice calm but firm. Alex tried to focus, to push past the discomfort in his body, but as she came to his side, he couldn't ignore the electric tension that thrummed between them. She was close, closer than she'd ever been during class. He could feel the heat of her presence, and as she stepped behind him, his entire body seemed to stiffen. The way she moved around him was fluid, almost as if she was gliding through the room, but it was also deliberate, intentional. Her touch, when it came, was light but firm. She placed one hand on his lower back to help deepen his stretch, guiding him further into the pose. "Relax," Sophie's voice was low, but it had a slight tremor to it. Alex wasn't sure if it was from the exertion or if it was something else. Something more. "Let go of the tension in your shoulders. Trust the movement." Alex's breath caught in his throat. He could feel her fingers pressing lightly into his back, her palm against his spine, sending a jolt of awareness through him. It was an ordinary correction, one she had made many times before, but today, in this moment, it felt different. The tension that had been building between them for weeks seemed to bubble up to the surface. He could feel the warmth of her touch lingering on his skin, his body responding to her proximity in ways he didn't know how to process. Her hand shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the side of his torso as she adjusted his alignment. The movement was so subtle, but it sent a shockwave through him. Alex's heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, he thought he might lose his balance, not from the physical stretch but from the weight of the moment. His mind raced, filled with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to entertain before. Was this just a normal correction? Was this just yoga? Or was there something more here, something neither of them could deny? He could feel her breath near his ear, her presence so close that it almost felt like an embrace. Sophie was no longer just a teacher, guiding him through poses. She was something else, someone else entirely. Every inch of him was aware of her, from the gentle pressure of her hand to the soft hum of her breath against his skin. The world around them seemed to fade as their connection deepened in a way that was almost too intimate to describe. Sophie pulled back slightly, stepping away from him. For a moment, they stood there in silence, their eyes meeting in a way that hadn't happened before. There was no rush to speak, no immediate need to fill the air with words. They both knew what was happening, though neither of them had the courage to name it yet. The space between them felt charged, thick with unspoken words and emotions. Sophie's gaze softened, and she gave him a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. "Good," she whispered, her voice still low. "You're doing great." But Alex wasn't sure he was doing great. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. The connection between them was undeniable, and he could feel it intensifying with every glance, every touch. He didn't know where this was going, but one thing was certain, the emotional tension that had simmered between them for so long was now at a boiling point. The air between them was heavy with possibility, and neither of them could ignore the way their feelings had shifted. As the class continued, Alex tried to refocus on his practice, but his mind kept returning to Sophie, her touch, her gaze, the way she had made him feel in that brief moment of proximity. The physical strain of the class paled in comparison to the emotional turmoil he was now navigating. It was as if he could no longer separate the two, his physical body and his growing emotional attraction. And with each passing moment, it became clearer to him that this was no longer just about yoga. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had the words to express, but both of them could feel. As the class came to a close, Sophie moved to the front of the room to lead the final meditation, but Alex lingered on his mat. He wasn't ready to leave yet, not until he could figure out what this was between them. But he knew, deep down, that whatever it was only a matter of time before it all came to the surface. As the weeks passed, the tension between Alex and Sophie remained unspoken but undeniable. It lingered in the quiet exchanges after class, the small glances they shared when their hands brushed against each other, and the lingering moments of silence that seemed to stretch out, filled with unvoiced feelings. Both of them were aware of the growing bond, though neither had yet acknowledged it fully. It was an uncharted territory, delicate and fragile, but unmistakable. One evening, after a particularly grueling class, Sophie invited Alex to join her for tea at a nearby cafe. The offer was casual, almost innocent, but Alex felt his heart skip a beat at the thought of spending time with her outside the studio. It wasn't just about yoga anymore. It was about the connection that had slowly but surely woven itself between them. They sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, the soft murmur of conversation around them fading into the background. Sophie looked different here, outside the structured walls of the yoga studio. Her hair was loose now, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore a simple, flowing dress that suited her graceful presence, and her eyes seemed softer, more open. As they talked, the conversation flowed effortlessly from yoga to more personal topics, how she had gotten into teaching, the challenges she had faced, and the quiet joys of her life. For the first time, Alex saw her not as an instructor, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own struggles. It was in these moments that Alex realized how deeply he had begun to care for her, not just for the way she had guided him in yoga, but for who she was, her warmth, her intelligence, and her quiet strength. She had drawn him in with her calm and steady presence, but now, in the quiet space between them, he could see her humanity, the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. As they sat sipping their tea, Alex felt the connection between them deepening. He realized that this was no longer just about the physical attraction or the tension that had built in the studio. It was about something far more profound, an emotional intimacy that had quietly blossomed over time. The moments of vulnerability they had shared, the quiet understanding they had developed, had brought them to this point. He was no longer just a student, and Sophie was no longer just a teacher. They were two people who had learned to trust each other, not just in yoga, but in life. Sophie smiled at him as she took another sip of tea, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "yoga teaches us to be present. To embrace the stillness and the moments in between. Sometimes, it's those moments that matter the most." Alex nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I think I'm starting to understand that," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. She smiled again, and this time, there was something in her smile that made his heart flutter. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent agreement that they both knew where this was heading. There was no dramatic confession, no rush to label what had been building between them. But in that quiet cafe, surrounded by the hum of life outside, Alex felt the resolution he had been searching for. This was just the beginning of something new, something exciting, and something they both would have to navigate together. The next morning, as Alex walked into the yoga studio for the final class of the week, he felt lighter. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Sophie's gaze met his as soon as he entered, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. There was no need for words, just the understanding that something had shifted. The air was charged, but not with tension. This time, it was with possibility. Yoga had brought them together, but it was the emotional connection they had cultivated over time that would carry them forward. And as Alex settled onto his mat, ready for the class, he knew that whatever came next, he wasn't walking this path alone.